Thank you, Mr. President. This past weekend, many world leaders came together in Switzerland to build consensus on the elements of a just peace in Ukraine. Those discussions took place in the wake of a sharp escalation of hostilities and an appalling increase in civilian casualties. According to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, this May, at least 174 civilians were killed and 690 injured in Ukraine. This is the highest number of civilian casualties in a single month since June last year. More than half of these casualties occurred in the Kharkiv region due to the Russian Federation's new offensive, launched on 10 May. There has been massive use of explosive weapons both in the Kharkiv region and in Kharkiv city, the second biggest city in Ukraine with over 1 million residents. On 23 May, missiles struck a printing house, killing 7 employees. On 25 May, 2 airdrop bombs struck a large home improvement center, killing 19 people. And on 31 May, missiles hit a residential area in the city, including a multi-story building, killing 9 civilians. North of Kharkiv city, the border town of Vovchansk saw some of the most intense fighting in the past month. It is now almost completely destroyed, with thousands of its residents forced to flee. This is a repeat of the devastation visited on Mariupol, Bakhmut, and Avdiivka earlier in the war. While Kharkiv has been the region most affected by the recent intensification of fightings, civilians continue to be killed and injured in other parts of Ukraine. Last week, on 13 June, an attack on Kryvyi Rih killed at least 9 people, including 5 children. Regular shelling and missile attacks by Russian Federation forces have also been reported in the Kherson region, including the city of Kherson, resulting in civilian casualties and forcing many of the city's residents to flee. The escalation of attacks impacting Ukrainian civilians is unconscionable. Since February 2022, OHCHR has recorded 11,126 civilians killed and 21,863 civilians injured. The actual figures are likely significantly higher. In the same period, Russian authorities have reported that at least 91 civilians have been killed and 455 injured in the Russian Federation, primarily in the Belgorod, Bryansk, and Kursk regions bordering Ukraine. We once again stress that attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure are prohibited by international law. They must stop immediately. Mr. President, the relentless attacks have also caused massive damage to civilian infrastructure. Even before the current escalation, a joint rapid damage and needs assessment conducted by Ukraine, the United Nations, the World Bank Group, and the European Commission estimated that, as of December 2023, reconstruction and recovery in Ukraine would cost some $486 billion over the next decade. Last week's recovery conference in Berlin demonstrated international solidarity and support for Ukraine's path to recovery. The longer the war continues, the greater the need for this global solidarity and support. The large-scale attacks by the Russian Federation against energy infrastructure have reduced Ukraine's energy-generating capacity by 68%. Periodic strikes imperiling the critical power supply to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant have also continued. Any attacks involving nuclear facilities are extremely dangerous and irresponsible. They must cease immediately. The United Nations Development Program has backed the provision of stable energy access for over 6 million people in Ukraine and is preparing for further delivery of energy equipment to help address shortages. But the worst consequences of the attacks against energy infrastructure are yet to be felt. This is because the shelling and airstrikes are also making it difficult to complete the repair of damaged facilities before next winter. Mr. President, the intensified hostilities add to the already difficult humanitarian situation. Thousands of people have been forced to flee their homes, and the UN is working with Ukrainian authorities to meet their immediate demands. So far this year, together with our partners, we have reached more than 4.4 million people with humanitarian assistance, thanks to our donors. The 2024 Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan is currently 27% funded. We urge our donors to sustain their generous financial support. This will allow us to continue to deliver life-saving assistance to the vulnerable population. Adequate funding is an issue everywhere, but for approximately 1.5 million people in need of humanitarian assistance in Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions of Ukraine currently under Russian occupation, the key challenge remains lack of access. International humanitarian law requires the facilitation of rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for all civilians in need, no matter where they live. We urge the Russian Federation to enable humanitarian access to areas under its control. Mr. President, this war has affected countries far beyond Ukraine's borders. The latest global report on food crises shows that in 2023, nearly 282 million people in 59 countries faced high levels of acute food insecurity. This represents an additional 24 million people since 2022. This rise has been driven by unfavorable crop conditions for the 2024 harvest and damage to shipping infrastructure and disruptions in navigation in the Black Sea and elsewhere. Over 80% of global trade is by sea. The Black Sea is a critical route, estimated to account for over a quarter of grain trade. Much more needs to be done to mitigate risks, reduce transaction costs, and bring more stability in global agricultural markets. The UN has therefore highlighted the importance of stabilizing critical trade routes for agricultural products. Mr. President, the human rights situation in the regions of Ukraine under Russian occupation remains extremely concerning. OHCHR has interviewed dozens of people who recently fled these regions. They report increased pressure to obtain Russian passports linked to the Russian presidential decree of 27 April 2023. According to the decree, people without Russian citizenship in the occupied areas of Ukraine's Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk regions will be considered foreigners after 1 July 2024. International humanitarian law prohibits an occupying power from compelling the population in occupied territory to swear allegiance to it. This includes forcing the population to obtain the occupying power's citizenship. Further, OHCHR has interviewed hundreds of released Ukrainian prisoners of war who recounted systematic and widespread torture and ill treatment, including sexual violence. We welcome the prisoner exchange of 31 May, in which 150 people were released, and urge the parties to continue and scale up such exchanges. There must be accountability for all violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, wherever they occur, in line with international norms and standards. Mr. President, 2.5 years since the Russian Federation's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, there is no let-up in the killing and destruction. The broader region is less stable and safe, while other parts of the world watch nervously as they continue to feel the economic and political consequences of the conflict. At the same time, discussion on possible ways to peace are multiplying. In Switzerland, over the weekend, many voices stress the need to adhere to the principles of the UN Charter. I'd like to stress that these principles are as valid today as they were in 1945. The Secretary General has been consistent and clear, calling for a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace in Ukraine, in line with the UN Charter, international law, and relevant General Assembly resolutions. The United Nations welcomes and is ready to support all meaningful efforts and initiatives towards this end. Thank you.